Behind me is what used to be a deputy's office. It closed in 1889 and never opened again. 18 men worked out of here and out of 17 other offices across 3 counties. Every one of them...
Kentucky Rage. Phoebe Cunningham slaughtered 18 deputies who killed her 12-year-old son. The bloodiest campaign of vengeance against law enforcement in American history, and the most devastating act of maternal fury the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of Phoebe Cunningham. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Leslie County, Kentucky, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the Commonwealth. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into violence. Hemmed in by the ancient Cumberland Plateau, the people who lived along the middle fork of the Kentucky River and its countless tributaries had been fighting for survival since the first settlers arrived, and for over 200 years, each succeeding generation had continued that fight. There were no telephones in most of these hollows even into the 20th century, and the roads were few and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most dangerous and ungovernable sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up through the feuds that had torn these communities apart, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. The deputies who enforced the law in these hollows were often as violent and lawless as the criminals they were supposed to pursue, men who used their badges to settle personal scores and to terrorize communities that could not defend themselves. You see, in these mountains, the deputy's badge was not seen as a symbol of protection, but as a license for brutality. Deputies rode into hollows and took what they wanted, arrested men on fabricated charges, beat those who showed insufficient respect, and sometimes killed with impunity. The sheriffs who appointed them cared only about results, about convictions and collections, and the maintenance of political power. How those results were achieved was a matter of indifference to them. The deputies operated with minimal oversight, answerable to no one except the sheriffs who protected them, free to exercise their authority in whatever manner they chose. The woman who would become known throughout eastern Kentucky simply as Phoebe was born, Phoebe Marie Collins, in 1867, in a cabin on the banks of Cutchin Creek that her grandfather had built with his own hands. She was not a large woman, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing perhaps 120 pounds, but there was something in her bearing that made people take notice. Her eyes were the color of gunmetal, and they held a steadiness that most men found unsettling. She moved through the world with a quiet confidence that suggested she was not someone to be trifled with, a woman who knew her own mind and would not be easily swayed from her purposes. That's right. Phoebe Collins had been raised in a family that valued strength and self-reliance above all other qualities. Her father had been a hunter and trapper, a man who spent more time in the wilderness than in any settlement, and he had taught his daughter skills that were unusual for a woman of her era. She could shoot as well as any man in Leslie County, could track game through the forest, could survive in the wilderness for weeks at a time if necessary. These skills had seemed merely interesting when she was young, accomplishments that set her apart from other girls without serving any obvious purpose. They would become something else entirely before her story was finished. Her hands were calloused from work, her body hardened by labor that had begun when she was barely old enough to walk. She had helped her father run his trap lines, had skinned animals and prepared hides for sale, had learned the patience required to wait for hours in silence for a shot that might never come. She had developed an understanding of violence that most women never acquired, a familiarity with death that came from taking the lives of countless animals over countless years. She understood that killing was sometimes necessary, that death was a tool like any other, to be used when circumstances required it. The skills her father taught her went beyond simple marksmanship. He taught her to read the forest, to understand the signs that animals left behind, to predict where prey would be before it arrived. He taught her to control her breathing, to slow her heartbeat, to achieve the perfect stillness that allowed a hunter to become invisible. He taught her that patience was the most important skill of all, that the hunter who could wait longer than her prey would always succeed. These lessons had been absorbed so deeply that they had become part of who Phoebe was, instincts rather than knowledge, as natural as breathing. Her reputation as a hunter had spread throughout Leslie County by the time she was a teenager. Men who had hunted all their lives came to her father asking for his secret, unable to understand how a girl could consistently bring home more game than experienced hunters twice her age. The secret, which Phoebe's father never shared, was that his daughter possessed a patience that approached the supernatural, a willingness to wait that made her virtually invisible to prey, that could not understand why the forest felt dangerous, even when nothing seemed to be there. The relationship between Phoebe and her father was closer than most, built on shared experiences in the wilderness that had created a bond that went beyond ordinary family connection. When he died in 1890, Phoebe was devastated, losing not just a parent, but the person who had shaped everything she would become. She inherited his rifle and his hunting grounds, his trap lines and his knowledge, and she carried all of it forward into the life she would build with Elijah Cunningham. Phoebe's marriage to a man named Elijah Cunningham in 1886 had been a good match by any measure. Elijah was a farmer and occasional logger, a quiet man who recognized in Phoebe qualities that complemented his own. Where he was patient and methodical, she was quick and decisive. Where he preferred to avoid conflict, she was willing to face it directly. Together they had built a farm in the hollow above Hyden that provided everything their family needed, a self-sufficient homestead that owed nothing to anyone and asked nothing from the outside world. The children came steadily through the late 1880s and 1890s, 6 of them in all, 4 sons and 2 daughters. The children inherited their mother's intensity and their father's patience, a combination that served them well in the demanding environment of the Kentucky mountains. They learned to work from the moment they could walk, contributing to the family's survival in whatever ways their ages and abilities allowed. The Cunningham farm became known throughout Leslie County as a model of what hard work and determination could accomplish. The son who would change everything was named Daniel, born in 1897 as the youngest of the Cunningham children. Danny, as everyone called him, was the light of his mother's life from the moment of his birth. He had inherited Phoebe's gunmetal eyes and her quick mind, along with a gentleness of spirit that seemed to come from somewhere outside the family entirely. He was the child who brought injured birds home to nurse back to health, who cried when the hogs were slaughtered, who seemed to feel the pain of every living creature he encountered. Phoebe loved all her children, but Danny held a special place in her heart that even she could not fully explain. By 1909, Danny Cunningham was 12 years old and already showing signs of the exceptional person he might become. He was the best student at the small school he attended when farm work permitted, quick with numbers and hungry for books in a way that set him apart from his classmates. He helped his father and brothers with the heavy work of the farm, never complaining despite his slight build and his preference for gentler pursuits. He had his mother's skill with a rifle, could shoot as straight as any of his older brothers, but he took no pleasure in killing and avoided hunting whenever he could. The Cunningham family, like most families in Leslie County, had occasional dealings with the deputies who enforced the law in the region. These encounters were rarely pleasant. The deputies who served under Sheriff Marcus Hensley were known throughout the county for their brutality and their corruption, men who used their authority to extract tribute from families who could not afford to resist. The Cunninghams had paid the bribes demanded of them, had endured the insults and the petty humiliations, had done what was necessary to protect their family from official attention. Now, to understand what happened in the summer of 1909, you need to understand the nature of law enforcement in Leslie County at that time. That's right. Sheriff Hensley had built his organization on a foundation of violence and intimidation, recruiting deputies who were essentially criminals themselves, men who saw the badge as an opportunity to pursue their worst impulses with legal protection. The sheriff collected a percentage of everything his deputies extracted from the population, creating a system of organized theft that operated under the cover of law enforcement. The deputies who worked for Hensley numbered over 30, spread throughout the county in groups that controlled specific territories. Each group operated semi-independently, responsible for its own area, and accountable to the sheriff only for the revenue it produced. Competition between groups was encouraged, with those who produced the most receiving the best assignments and the greatest share of the proceeds. This system created incentives for ever-increasing brutality as deputies sought to extract more from populations that had less and less to give. The group that controlled the territory around Hyden was led by a man named Deputy Samuel Weston, a former logger who had discovered that wearing a badge was more profitable than cutting trees. Weston was 34 years old, a large man with a reputation for violence that exceeded even the norms of Hensley's organization. He had killed at least 3 men during his tenure as deputy, all of them ruled justified by investigations that were conducted by his fellow deputies. He was feared throughout his territory, and that fear was exactly what he cultivated. Weston had been watching the Cunningham family for months, noting their prosperity, calculating how much could be extracted from them. The farm was one of the most successful in the area, which meant it was a target that promised significant returns. Weston had decided that the time had come to increase the pressure on the Cunninghams, to demand payments that would strain even their resources, and to make an example of them if they resisted. And that's when Deputy Samuel Weston and 5 of his men rode onto the Cunningham property to deliver their demands. You see, the confrontation was designed from the beginning to escalate into violence. Weston wanted an excuse to demonstrate his power, to show the community what happened to families that did not show proper respect to the deputies who controlled their lives. He arrived at the Cunningham farm on a hot July morning with a list of grievances that had been manufactured for the occasion, accusations of unpaid taxes and unlicensed activities that existed only in his imagination. Elijah Cunningham met the deputies in the yard, trying to defuse a situation that he could see was dangerous. He offered to pay whatever fines Weston demanded, agreed to whatever conditions were imposed, did everything in his power to avoid the confrontation that the deputy was clearly seeking. But Weston was not interested in compliance. He was interested in violence, in the demonstration of power that would terrorize the entire community into submission. The deputies began searching the property, ostensibly looking for evidence of the violations they had alleged. In reality, they were looking for anything of value that could be seized, any excuse to escalate the encounter into the kind of confrontation that would justify the use of force. They tore through the cabin, scattering possessions that the family had accumulated over decades, destroying things simply for the pleasure of destruction. Danny Cunningham was in the barn when the deputies arrived, doing his morning chores, unaware of the danger that had entered the property. He heard the commotion and came to investigate, emerging from the barn just as Deputy Weston was threatening his father with arrest, on charges that made no sense. Danny did what any brave 12-year-old boy would do. He ran to his father's defense, shouting at the deputies to leave his family alone, inserting himself into a situation that he was too young to understand. What happened next would be disputed for years, with the deputies claiming one version of events and the surviving Cunninghams another. What is certain is that Danny Cunningham died that morning, shot multiple times by deputies who claimed he had threatened them with a weapon. The weapon was never found. The boy's body showed wounds that suggested he had been shot while running away, shot in the back by men who faced no threat from a 12-year-old child. But the official investigation, conducted by Sheriff Hensley himself, concluded that the shooting was justified, that Danny had posed a deadly threat, and that Deputy Weston and his men had acted properly in defending themselves. Phoebe Cunningham was working in the garden behind the cabin when the shots were fired. She heard them and ran toward the sound, arriving in time to see her youngest son lying in the dust of the farmyard, his blood soaking into the earth, his life already gone. She gathered him in her arms, held him against her chest, felt the warmth leaving his body as she screamed words that had no meaning. The deputies stood around her in a circle, some of them looking uncomfortable, others simply waiting for the scene to be over so they could continue their business. Elijah tried to comfort his wife, tried to take Danny's body from her arms, tried to bring some order to a moment that had shattered everything they had built together. But Phoebe would not let go of her son, would not release the body that had been so full of life just moments before, would not accept the reality of what had happened. She held Danny for hours, sitting in the dust while the sun moved across the sky, while the deputies eventually rode away with their stolen goods, while the rest of the family gathered around her, in a grief too large for words. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church, where the Cunninghams had worshipped for generations. The entire community turned out. Hundreds of people who understood that what had happened to Danny could have happened to any of their children. Phoebe stood at the graveside without weeping, her gunmetal eyes fixed on the small coffin that held everything she had loved most in the world. Her face showed nothing, revealed nothing, gave no hint of what was happening inside her. Those who knew her best recognized this blankness as something dangerous, the calm before a storm that would make the violence of Danny's death seem small by comparison. That night, after the mourners had departed and the house had fallen silent, Phoebe Cunningham sat alone in the darkness and made a vow that would define the rest of her life. She would kill them. Every deputy who had participated in her son's murder, every deputy who served the system that had made his murder possible, every man who wore a badge in Leslie County and used it to terrorize innocent families. She would hunt them down one by one, and she would make them pay with their lives for the life they had taken from her. There would be no mercy, no hesitation, no end until the debt was paid in full. And that vow, spoken over the memory of a boy who died for nothing, would be fulfilled beyond anything Phoebe Cunningham herself could have imagined. You see, Phoebe Cunningham didn't act impulsively despite her overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. She understood that emotion-driven action would only get her killed before she could accomplish her purpose. Instead, she spent the months following Danny's death preparing for a campaign that would require every skill she had developed over a lifetime of hunting and survival. Her father had taught her to track and to shoot, to move through the forest without being seen, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Now she would apply those lessons to different prey. The planning process took nearly 4 months, during which Phoebe maintained the appearance of a woman broken by grief. She went through the motions of her daily life, tending the farm, caring for her family, attending church on Sundays. She spoke little, smiled never, seemed to have retreated into a shell from which she might never emerge. Her family worried about her, tried to reach her, offered comfort that she accepted without acknowledgement. No one suspected that behind the facade of grief, a mind was working ceaselessly on problems of tactics and execution. The intelligence she gathered was comprehensive and detailed. She learned the identities of every deputy who had participated in the raid that killed Danny, every man who had been present when her son was shot. She expanded her list to include other deputies who served in Weston's group, men who had participated in similar raids and similar killings. She studied their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She learned where they lived, where they drank, where they were most likely to be alone and unprotected. Her skills as a hunter served her well in this reconnaissance. She could move through the forest without being seen, could observe from positions that no one thought to watch, could gather information without revealing her presence. She spent weeks tracking individual deputies, learning their patterns, identifying the moments when they would be most vulnerable to attack. By the time she was ready to act, she knew more about these men than they knew about themselves. The weapons she prepared for her campaign were the same ones she had used for hunting her entire life. Her rifle was a Winchester lever-action that her father had given her when she was 16, a weapon she could load and fire faster than most men could manage with their own firearms. Her pistol was a Colt revolver that Elijah had bought for her after their marriage, a sidearm she had practiced with until it felt like an extension of her own hand. These were not weapons of war but tools of the hunt, and Phoebe was the finest hunter in Leslie County. The list of targets that Phoebe compiled eventually numbered 18 deputies, the 6 who had participated directly in Danny's killing, and 12 others who served in Weston's group and had committed similar atrocities against other families. She knew she could not kill them all immediately, that any attempt to strike too quickly would result in her own death before her work was complete. She would have to be patient, to take them one at a time, to make each killing look like something other than what it was until her pattern became undeniable. The first killing came on the night of a new moon in November 1909, 4 months after Danny's death. The target was the deputy who had actually pulled the trigger that killed her son, a man named Thomas Ballard, who had bragged about the shooting in the weeks that followed. Ballard was 28 years old, unmarried, known to spend his evenings drinking at a roadhouse several miles from his boarding house. He would walk home alone on dark nights, confident that his badge protected him from any threat. Phoebe waited in the forest along the path Ballard always took, positioned herself in a spot where she had clear lines of sight in both directions, where she could see her target coming and ensure that no one else was nearby. She had waited like this countless times before, for deer and for turkey and for bear, her body still, her breathing slow, her mind focused on nothing except the moment when her prey would appear. The skills were identical, only the target was different. Ballard appeared shortly after midnight, stumbling slightly from the whiskey he had consumed, singing a song whose words were slurred beyond recognition. He never saw Phoebe, never knew she was there until the rifle bullet struck him in the chest. He fell without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Phoebe waited for 5 minutes, ensuring that no one had heard the shot, that no one was coming to investigate. Then she disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a body that would not be discovered until morning. The killing of Thomas Ballard was attributed to unknown assailants, probably moonshiners with a grudge or feudists settling old scores. Deputies died with some regularity in Leslie County, and Ballard's death, while notable, did not immediately suggest a pattern. Sheriff Hensley ordered an investigation that went nowhere, offered a reward that attracted no useful information, and eventually concluded that the killing would remain unsolved. Life went on, and the deputies continued their work as if nothing had changed. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another deputy who had been present when Danny died. This man, Calvin Pierce, was found dead in his own barn, shot through the head while apparently doing his evening chores. The killing was cleaner than the first, showing a refinement of technique that came from experience. Pierce had never known he was in danger, had never seen the rifle that ended his life, had died without any opportunity to defend himself or call for help. That's right. Phoebe Cunningham continued her campaign through the winter and into the spring, striking with a patience that kept her enemies from recognizing the pattern until it was too late. The third deputy died in January 1910, found frozen in a creek bed with a bullet wound that had killed him hours before the cold would have. He had been returning from a tavern where he had spent the evening drinking and boasting about his exploits as a deputy, unaware that someone was watching him from the forest, waiting for the moment when he would be alone on a stretch of road where no one would hear the shot. The fourth died in February, ambushed on a road he traveled every week to collect payments from farms in his territory. Phoebe had studied this man for over a month, learning his schedule, identifying the point on his route where he was most vulnerable. She had prepared her position days in advance, had tested her sight lines and her escape routes, had left nothing to chance. When the moment came, she took her shot with the same calm precision she had always brought to hunting, and the deputy died, without ever knowing who had killed him. The fifth died in March, shot through a window, while eating dinner with his family. This killing was more difficult than the others, requiring Phoebe to approach an occupied home in a populated area, to take her shot and escape before anyone could respond. She accomplished it by waiting for a night of heavy rain, when the sound of the storm would cover both her approach and the crack of her rifle. The deputy's wife found him slumped over his plate, dead from a single shot that had entered through the window and struck him in the temple. The methods Phoebe developed for each killing reflected her understanding that no two situations were identical, that each target required an approach tailored to their specific circumstances. Some deputies were cautious, varying their routines, traveling in company, taking precautions that made them difficult targets. Others were careless, confident that their badges protected them, following patterns that made them easy prey. Phoebe adapted to each situation, finding the weakness in each deputy's defenses, exploiting it with lethal efficiency. Each killing demonstrated Phoebe's evolution as a hunter of men. She learned which approaches were safest, which times offered the greatest opportunity, which methods left the least evidence of her presence. She developed techniques for covering her tracks, for establishing alibis, for deflecting suspicion away from herself. Her skills improved with practice, as skills always do, until she could take a life with an efficiency that would have impressed professional assassins. The investigation into the deputy killings became increasingly urgent as the death toll mounted. By the time 5 deputies had died, Sheriff Hensley understood that someone was systematically targeting his men, picking them off one by one with a precision that suggested careful planning. The killer seemed to know things that should have been secret, appeared to anticipate the movements of his deputies, struck at moments when they were most vulnerable. The level of skill demonstrated by the killings suggested a professional assassin, someone with training and experience that exceeded anything the local population should possess. He ordered his deputies to travel in pairs, to vary their routines, to take precautions that would make them harder targets. He brought in investigators from outside the county, men who had experience with organized criminal activity and who might see patterns that local officers had missed. He offered rewards for information, posted guards at likely ambush points, did everything he could think of to protect his remaining men. These measures slowed Phoebe's campaign, but did not stop it. The investigators developed theories about who might be responsible for the killings. They considered feudists settling old scores, moonshiners seeking revenge for raids, criminal organizations moving into the area. They interviewed hundreds of people, examined every piece of evidence they could find, constructed elaborate theories about the killer's identity and motivations. None of their theories included a middle-aged farm wife who had learned to hunt from her father. The sixth killing demonstrated that Phoebe could adapt to changing circumstances. When the deputies began traveling in pairs, she waited for a moment when two of them were isolated together, then killed them both within seconds of each other. The double killing shocked the department, revealed a level of skill that exceeded anything they had anticipated, and forced them to acknowledge that they were facing an adversary unlike any they had encountered before. Deputy Samuel Weston, the man who had led the raid that killed Danny, became increasingly paranoid as his men continued to die around him. He fortified his home, hired personal guards, varied his movements in ways designed to make him unpredictable. He understood that he was likely a primary target, that whoever was killing his deputies would eventually come for him. He was determined to survive, to outlast the threat, to kill whoever was responsible before they could kill him. The seventh and eighth killings came in quick succession in April 1910, demonstrating that Phoebe's campaign was accelerating rather than slowing down. The ninth came on the first anniversary of Danny's death, a symbolic date that could not be coincidental. By midsummer 1910, 9 deputies were dead, and the investigation had finally identified Phoebe Cunningham as the primary suspect. The connection had been made by a state detective who had been brought in to assist the investigation. He had noticed that all the dead deputies had one thing in common. They had all been present at the Cunningham farm on the day Danny was killed, or they had participated in similar raids that had resulted in civilian deaths. The pattern pointed unmistakably at someone seeking revenge for those deaths, and the Cunningham family was the most obvious source of such revenge. The surveillance of Phoebe Cunningham began in August 1910 and continued for 2 months without producing direct evidence of her involvement in the killings. Phoebe went about her daily business, tending her farm, caring for her family, showing no sign of the deadly campaign she was conducting. The watchers reported nothing suspicious, no unexplained absences, no secret meetings, no behavior that suggested she was anything other than a grieving mother trying to rebuild her life. And that's when the 10th deputy died, on a night when Phoebe had been under surveillance the entire time. You see, Phoebe had known about the surveillance almost from the moment it began. Her years of hunting had taught her to notice when the forest was different, when something had changed in the patterns she knew so well. She had spotted the watchers within days of their arrival and had immediately understood what their presence meant. Rather than stopping her campaign, she had adapted it, finding ways to strike that the watchers could not detect. The killing that baffled the investigators was accomplished through a method that Phoebe had developed specifically for situations where she could not leave her home. She had prepared a shooting position on her own property, concealed in a location that provided lines of sight to a road over a mile away. From this position, she could observe the route that deputies used to travel through the area, could wait for a target to appear, and could take a shot that would be almost impossible to trace back to her. The watchers who monitored her movements never saw her leave the farm. They did not understand that she did not need to leave to reach her targets. The 11th killing followed the same pattern, accomplished from Phoebe's property while investigators watched her every move. The 12th required a different approach, as the remaining deputies had learned to avoid the roads that were visible from the Cunningham farm. Phoebe waited until the surveillance was reduced, then struck quickly before it could be reinforced. Her patience and her flexibility made her almost impossible to catch. The investigation reached its height in the fall of 1910, with dozens of investigators working to build a case against Phoebe Cunningham. They interviewed everyone who knew her, searched her property repeatedly, analyzed every piece of evidence they could find. But Phoebe had been too careful, had covered her tracks too completely, had left nothing that could prove her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The investigators knew she was responsible, but knowing was not the same as proving. The 13th killing came in October 1910, followed by the 14th in November and the 15th in December. The pace of the killings was increasing, suggesting that Phoebe had decided to complete her work regardless of the risks. Each death brought the investigators closer to proving their case, but each death also reduced the number of witnesses who could testify about the raid that had started everything. The deputies who remained alive were terrified, understanding that they could not hide forever, that eventually the woman hunting them would find a way to reach them. Deputy Samuel Weston remained the primary target that Phoebe had not yet reached. He had survived through extreme caution, never leaving his fortified home except in the company of multiple guards, never traveling on routes that could be predicted, never exposing himself to the kind of ambush that had killed so many of his men. Phoebe watched and waited, patient as she had always been, knowing that eventually Weston would make a mistake that would give her the opportunity she needed. The 16th and 17th killings came in early 1911, reducing Weston's group to a handful of survivors who had abandoned their duties and fled the county rather than face the woman who was hunting them. The sheriff's department was in shambles, unable to function, its remaining deputies refusing to patrol the territories they had once controlled. The system of organized theft that Sheriff Hensley had built was collapsing, destroyed not by official reform, but by the patient vengeance of a mother whose child had been murdered. The 18th and final killing came on a night in March 1911, when Deputy Samuel Weston finally made the mistake that Phoebe had been waiting for. He had received word that his mother was dying, that she was calling for him, that he needed to come immediately if he wanted to see her one last time. The message was false, sent by someone whose identity was never determined, but Weston believed it and left his fortified home with only 2 guards to protect him. Phoebe was waiting along the route to Weston's mother's house, positioned in a location she had prepared months earlier for exactly this possibility. She killed the 2 guards first, clean shots that dropped them before they could react, before they could warn their employer of the danger. Then she stepped out of the trees and faced Weston directly, allowing him to see who had been hunting him for nearly 2 years, allowing him to understand why he was about to die. What passed between them in those final moments was never recorded, known only to Phoebe and to the man she killed. Perhaps she told him about Danny, about the boy whose life he had taken so casually. Perhaps she told him about the other children who had died at the hands of his deputies, the other families who had been destroyed by his greed and his cruelty. Perhaps she said nothing at all, simply raised her rifle and ended him as she had ended 17 of his men before him. When the bodies were found the next morning, there was no witness to describe what had happened, no evidence beyond the bullets that had done their work with terrible efficiency. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Phoebe Cunningham was arrested 3 days after Samuel Weston's death, charged with 18 counts of murder based on evidence that the investigators had finally accumulated over months of work. The case against her was largely circumstantial, built on patterns and coincidences rather than direct proof, but the prosecutors believed they had enough to secure a conviction. Phoebe did not resist arrest, did not attempt to flee, seemed almost relieved that her work was finished and that she could finally stop hiding. The trial of Phoebe Cunningham became the most famous criminal proceeding in Kentucky history, drawing journalists from across the country and spectators who filled the courthouse beyond capacity. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks, far longer than typical murder trials, as both sides presented their cases with exhaustive thoroughness. The courtroom was packed every day, with people lining up before dawn to secure seats, with crowds gathering outside to hear second-hand reports of what was happening within. The prosecution presented its case methodically, describing each killing and connecting it to Phoebe through the web of evidence they had assembled. They called witnesses who had seen her near the locations of some killings, experts who testified about the ballistics evidence, investigators who described the pattern they had uncovered. They portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who had murdered 18 men in calculated revenge, who had shown no mercy and no remorse. The prosecutor was a young man named William Garrett, ambitious and determined to make his reputation with a conviction that would be remembered for generations. He spoke eloquently about the rule of law, about the danger of allowing individuals to take justice into their own hands, about the chaos that would result if everyone who felt wronged were permitted to kill those they held responsible. His arguments were legally sound, his evidence carefully presented, his case apparently overwhelming. The defense argued that Phoebe had been driven to her actions by the murder of her son, that the deputies she killed were themselves murderers who had escaped justice through a corrupt system, that any mother in her situation might have done the same. The defense attorney, an elderly lawyer named Isaiah Morgan, who had come out of retirement to take the case, spoke with a passion that moved many in the courtroom to tears. He described Danny's death in graphic detail, showed the jury photographs of the crime scene, called witnesses who testified to the brutality of Weston's group. They presented witnesses who testified to the brutality of Weston's group, families who had suffered similar losses, evidence of the crimes that the deputies had committed under color of law. They asked the jury to understand, if not to forgive, what Phoebe had done. The jury deliberated for 5 days, longer than anyone had expected, suggesting that the decision was not as straightforward as the prosecution had hoped. When they finally returned, their verdict stunned the courtroom: not guilty on all counts. The acquittal was controversial then, and remains controversial to this day. Some argued that the jury had simply refused to convict a grieving mother for avenging her son, that they had engaged in jury nullification rather than following the law. Others argued that the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt, that the circumstantial evidence was insufficient to support a conviction. Still others suggested that the jurors understood something that the legal system could not acknowledge, that Phoebe had delivered a justice that the courts had been unable or unwilling to provide. Phoebe Cunningham walked out of the courthouse a free woman, returning to the farm where her son was buried, to the family that had supported her throughout her ordeal. She never spoke publicly about the killings, never confirmed or denied her responsibility, never explained her methods or her motivations. The story of what she had done passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. The aftermath of Phoebe's campaign reshaped law enforcement in Leslie County for a generation. Sheriff Hensley was removed from office within months of the trial's conclusion, his organization destroyed, his political allies abandoning him as the full extent of his corruption became public. The investigation into Phoebe's killings had exposed patterns of abuse that went far beyond the raid on the Cunningham farm, documenting years of extortion, violence, and murder that had characterized law enforcement under Hensley's leadership. The deputies who had survived Phoebe's campaign fled the county, understanding that they could never be safe in a place where 18 of their colleagues had been methodically killed. Some went west, hoping to start new lives far from anyone who knew their history. Others joined law enforcement in different jurisdictions where their records were unknown and their past could not follow them. A few simply disappeared, their ultimate fates unknown, perhaps victims of other grudges that Phoebe's campaign had inspired. The system of organized theft that had operated under the cover of law enforcement collapsed completely. The families who had been paying tribute to Hensley's deputies stopped paying, understanding that the system that had enforced those payments no longer existed. The businesses that had been forced to share their profits with corrupt officials kept their money. The farms that had been raided and looted were left in peace. The economic impact of the system's collapse was significant, returning resources to communities that had been impoverished by years of systematic theft. The reforms that followed were driven partly by the exposure of corruption that had come out during Phoebe's trial. New oversight mechanisms were established to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Hensley's abuses. Deputies were required to account for their actions in ways that had never been demanded before, Complaints from citizens were investigated rather than dismissed. The relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served began a slow transformation that would take decades to complete. The political fallout from Phoebe's campaign extended beyond Leslie County. State legislators who had protected Hensley faced questions about their role in enabling his abuses. Prosecutors who had declined to investigate complaints against his deputies saw their careers damaged by association with corruption. The entire system of county law enforcement in eastern Kentucky was subjected to scrutiny that had not existed before. The culture of law enforcement in the region began a slow transformation that would take decades to complete, but that began with the deaths of 18 men who had believed themselves above the law. Phoebe Cunningham lived another 34 years after her acquittal, dying peacefully in her bed in 1945 at the age of 78. She had seen her surviving children grow to adulthood and have families of their own, had watched her grandchildren and great-grandchildren begin lives that would have been unimaginable to Danny if he had lived. She had outlived everyone who had participated in her son's death, had outlived the system that had protected his killers, had lived long enough to see the world change in ways both good and bad. The years following her trial were remarkably quiet for Phoebe Cunningham. She returned to the life she had known before Danny's death, working the farm, caring for her family, attending church on Sundays. She never spoke publicly about the killings, never gave interviews to the journalists who occasionally sought her out, never confirmed or denied the things that everyone believed she had done. Her silence on the subject was absolute, a wall that no one ever breached. The community treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence, understanding what she had done and why she had done it, accepting her back into their midst without judgment or condemnation. Women brought her food when she was sick, helped with her farm work when she needed assistance, treated her as they would treat any respected elder. Men tipped their hats when they passed her on the road, stepped aside to let her enter buildings first, showed her courtesies that were not extended to other women. She was one of them, had always been one of them, and her actions had been taken in defense of values that they all shared. Her hunting skills remained sharp throughout her life, though she used them less frequently as she aged. She continued to provide game for her family's table, continued to run trap lines that her father had established decades earlier, continued to walk the forest paths she had known since childhood. The forest was her church, the place where she felt closest to something larger than herself, and she spent more and more time there as the years passed. Her relationship with Elijah deepened in the years following the trial, the bond between them strengthened by the ordeal they had survived together. Elijah had known what Phoebe was doing during her campaign, had understood without ever being told directly, had supported her in the only way he could by keeping their family together while she hunted the men who had killed their son. Their partnership, which had always been strong, became something that transcended ordinary understanding. The evening visits to Danny's grave continued throughout Phoebe's remaining years. Every day, as the sun began to set, she would walk up the hillside to the small cemetery behind the church and stand at her son's grave for an hour or more. Neighbors who passed the cemetery would see her small figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, her lips moving in words they could not hear. She never stopped grieving for Danny, never accepted his death, never forgave the men who had taken him from her. The killing she had done had been justice, not healing, and the wound in her heart remained open until the day she died. Elijah Cunningham died in 1938, 7 years before his wife, worn out by a life that had contained more sorrow than any person should have to bear. Phoebe was with him at the end, holding his hand, listening as he spoke Danny's name for the last time. He had never blamed her for what she had done, had never questioned her judgment, had loved her through everything with a constancy that never wavered. His grave lies beside Danny's in the cemetery behind the church, and Phoebe's lies beside his, the family united in death as they had been in life. The grave of Danny Cunningham became something of a pilgrimage site in the years following his mother's trial, visited by people who wanted to pay their respects to the boy, whose death had sparked such extraordinary events. Visitors came from throughout eastern Kentucky and beyond, strangers who had heard the story and wanted to see the place where it had begun, to stand where Phoebe had stood and feel what she must have felt. The stone that marked his resting place bore only his name and dates, but everyone who visited knew the larger story. Danny had been 12 years old when he died, Shot by deputies who faced no accountability through official channels, murdered by a system that valued badge and power over the lives of children. His mother had answered that murder with blood, and 18 men had paid for their crimes with their lives. The story of Phoebe Cunningham passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about her, ballads that celebrated her determination and mourned the death of her son. Some portrayed her as a hero who had delivered justice where the law could not. Others painted her as a dangerous killer who had taken vengeance into her own hands. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Phoebe Cunningham story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Danny's death and ending with the acquittal. These songs named names, described specific killings, celebrated Phoebe's skill and patience in ways that made them almost instructional for anyone contemplating similar actions. Others focused on particular moments, dramatizing specific killings or the tense days of the trial. One popular ballad described the first killing, the death of Thomas Ballard on that moonless November night. The song portrayed Phoebe waiting in the darkness, her rifle steady, her breathing slow, her patience infinite. It captured the moment of the shot and the silence that followed, the body falling without a sound, the hunter disappearing into the forest. The image became iconic, repeated in countless retellings, a symbol of the terrible patience that had allowed one woman to destroy an entire organization of corrupt deputies. Another song focused on the relationship between Phoebe and Danny, describing the bond between mother and son in terms that brought audiences to tears. The song imagined Danny's last moments, his futile attempt to defend his father, the bullets that cut him down before he could understand what was happening. It then traced Phoebe's transformation from grieving mother to relentless hunter, showing how love could become something dark and terrible when it was violated by unforgivable cruelty. A third song told the story of the trial, dramatizing the conflict between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, portraying the jury's deliberations as a battle for the soul of justice itself. This song captured the tension of those final days, the crowd waiting for a verdict that would define how the community understood what Phoebe had done, the relief and the controversy that followed the acquittal. It was sung less often than the narrative ballads, but those who heard it never forgot its powerful portrayal of justice in conflict with law. The most famous of these songs, known as Phoebe's Reckoning, was composed in 1915 by a musician who had attended the trial and who had been moved by what he witnessed there. The song was over 20 verses long, telling the complete story from beginning to end with a detail that suggested the composer had access to information that was not publicly known. His song has been sung in these mountains for over a century, passed from generation to generation, preserved in recordings and in the memories of singers who learned it from their parents and grandparents. One popular ballad described the moment when Phoebe faced Samuel Weston for the final time, imagining the conversation that might have passed between them before she pulled the trigger. The song gave voice to Phoebe's grief and her rage, put words to emotions that she herself had never expressed publicly. It became one of the most requested songs at mountain gatherings, sung by voices that cracked with emotion at verses describing Danny's death and the vengeance that followed. Another song told the story from the perspective of the deputies, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood they were being hunted by someone they could not find, someone who could reach them no matter where they hid or how they protected themselves. It was sung less often than the heroic ballads, but those who heard it never forgot its haunting portrayal of men waiting to die. Historians who have studied the Phoebe Cunningham case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of community justice, a response to a system so corrupt that ordinary legal remedies were unavailable. Others have focused on gender, noting that Phoebe's acquittal might have been influenced by expectations about maternal grief and feminine weakness that seem dated today. Still others have examined the case as a study in jury nullification, an example of citizens refusing to convict despite clear evidence of guilt. You see, what Phoebe Cunningham did cannot be justified by any conventional legal framework. She killed 18 men, most of them shot from ambush without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that her victims were corrupt deputies who had committed terrible crimes does not eliminate the fact that she acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not hers to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. She was a mother whose 12-year-old son had been shot down by men who faced no accountability through official channels. The system that should have protected Danny had instead killed him. The courts that should have punished his killers had instead exonerated them. There was no legitimate avenue for redress, no institution that would hold the murderers accountable. What options did Phoebe have? What would any mother do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate justice? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The shooting of Danny Cunningham was ruled justified, processed through proper procedures by authorized officials. But it was not just. It was murder, plain and simple, committed by men who used their badges to kill a child without consequence. Phoebe Cunningham created accountability where none existed, demonstrated that power had limits, and forced changes that benefited everyone who lived under the law enforcement system of Eastern Kentucky. The specific circumstances that produced the Phoebe Cunningham story have changed in the decades since those killings occurred. The deputy system that allowed men like Samuel Weston to terrorize communities has been reformed, its worst abuses eliminated by oversight mechanisms that did not exist in 1909. The possibility of a 12-year-old boy being shot by deputies and his killers facing no consequences seems unthinkable today, but it was not unthinkable in 1909, and the story of Danny Cunningham stands as a reminder of what can happen when law enforcement operates without adequate accountability. But the underlying questions that Phoebe's story raises have not disappeared entirely. Law enforcement officers still sometimes use excessive force. Children still sometimes become casualties of encounters that should never have turned violent. The gap between what the law promises and what it delivers remains wide enough to generate rage and despair in those who find themselves on the wrong side of that gap. The story of Phoebe Cunningham serves as a reminder of what can happen when that gap becomes unbridgeable, when mothers lose faith in institutions that are supposed to protect their children. The descendants of Phoebe Cunningham still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. Some have become law enforcement officers themselves, trying to reform the system from within, determined to ensure that what happened to Danny never happens to another child. Others have become lawyers and advocates, working through legitimate channels to achieve the accountability that their ancestor sought through blood. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over a century ago, a campaign that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. Family reunions are held annually in the Hollow, where Phoebe raised her children, gatherings that bring together descendants from across Kentucky and beyond. At these reunions, the story of Phoebe and Danny is told to children who might otherwise forget, the details preserved through oral tradition as they have been for over a century. Old photographs are passed around, images that show a woman whose gunmetal eyes seem to pierce through time itself, who looks directly at the camera with an intensity that makes viewers uncomfortable even a century after the pictures were taken. The older members of the family can name every deputy that Phoebe killed, can describe the circumstances of each death, can recount the trial and the acquittal that followed. They know which songs tell the story accurately and which take liberties with the truth. They understand the weight of carrying a name that is known throughout Eastern Kentucky, a name that evokes both admiration and unease depending on who is hearing it. The story has become sacred text, a founding myth that defines what it means to be a Cunningham. The site where Danny Cunningham was killed remains in the family to this day, the farmhouse rebuilt over the years, but occupying the same ground where a 12-year-old boy was shot for trying to defend his father against men who wore badges and used them to commit murder. Few visitors to the farm know the full story of what happened there, but those who do approach the place with a reverence that speaks to the power of the events it witnessed. The Hollow has been peaceful for over a century now, the violence of 1909 and its bloody aftermath fading into memory and legend, but the earth remembers what was spilled upon it and always will. The mountains of Leslie County remain today much as they were in 1909, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear through hollows that have sheltered families for generations, their waters carrying the same minerals and the same music they have carried since long before humans came to settle here. The trees still change color each autumn, painting the mountainsides with shades of gold and red that take the breath away, that remind those who see them of why people chose to make their homes in such difficult and beautiful country. The corrupt deputy system that once terrorized these communities has been dismantled, replaced by law enforcement that is imperfect but vastly better than what came before. Those who live in these hills still tell stories about Phoebe Cunningham, about the mother who killed 18 deputies, about what happens when the law murders children and mothers decide to respond. The story of Phoebe Cunningham endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of maternal love and what that love becomes when it is violated by unspeakable cruelty, when a mother's instinct to protect is transformed into something dark and terrible. It is the story of skill and patience, of rage contained until it could be released with devastating effect upon those who had earned it through their own cruelty. It is the story of power and its illusions, of systems that seem unbreakable until someone finds the courage and the ability to break them apart. It is finally a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Phoebe Cunningham stood, to see the hollow where she lived and the hillside where she and Danny rest together for all eternity? Would you walk the paths she walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, treacherous in places, and the hollow where the Cunningham homestead stood is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That standing in that place and knowing that dark history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs alone. The mountains keep their secrets well, holding the memory of Phoebe Cunningham close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient and eternal peaks. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Leslie County in those terrible years, as long as mothers love their children with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find their own ways to respond. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow she loved and defended with everything she had. But what she did and what was done to her family echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Phoebe Cunningham, who slaughtered 18 deputies after they killed her 12-year-old son Danny in the farmyard of their home on a summer morning that should have been like any other. A story of love and loss, of blood and fury, of justice found at last where the law could not provide it. The mountains remember her patience and her terrible righteous rage, and through them, so do we all.